United Church of Christ, as I've said, we're fond of saying that God is still speaking. And this is a strong theologically sound way of expressing the presence of God. Because in our collective understanding, we know that God didn't go silent when the ink dried in Revelation. God is still in the world today. But the bigger question for us today, I think, is although God is still speaking, are we listening? Are we listening for God's invitation? And maybe more importantly, are we putting that invitation into action? I invite you now to listen for God's invitation as you hear these ancient but relevant words from the Gospel according to Matthew.
The reading today is from Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. Parable of the wedding party. Jesus responded by speaking again in parables. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding party for his son. He sent his servants to call those invited to the wedding party, but they didn't want to come. Again, he sent other servants and said to them, "Tell those who have been invited, look, the meal is all prepared. I've butchered oxen and the fatted cattle. Now everything's ready. Come to the wedding party." But they paid no attention and went away, some to their fields, others to their businesses. The rest of them grabbed his servants, abused them, and killed them. The king was angry. He sent his soldiers to destroy those murderers and set the city on fire. Then he said to his servants, "The wedding party is prepared, but those who were invited weren't worthy. Therefore, go to the roads on the edge of town and invite everyone you find to the wedding party." Then those servants went to the roads and gathered everyone they found, both evil and good. The wedding party was full of guests. Now when the king came in and saw the guests, he spotted a man who wasn't wearing wedding clothes. He said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes?" But he was speechless. Then the king said to his servants, "Tie his hands and feet and throw him out into the farthest darkness. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth." Many people are invited, but few people are chosen.
And Patty promised she was going to explain that one.
No, I
Oh, there's the text. Yeah, when I first started to write this, in my first draft of the sermon, it started out, well, this one's a doozy. I took that back out. When I was about Manny's age, sophomore in high school, I was invited to a birthday party. But even though I had verbally accepted the invitation, I didn't go. I don't really know why. I used the excuse that I didn't have a gift and that no one would really care if I came anyway. So I stayed home. But the host of the party, and especially one of my friends, were extremely upset with me for not attending. Even though there were tons and tons of people there, they noticed that I didn't show up. As I pondered the meaning of today's text, I remembered this incident. And I, perhaps for the first time, understand why my friend was so upset. You see, like those who were invited to the wedding party in this parable, it must have seemed to her that I couldn't bother to show up. Through my actions, I was unintentionally saying to her, "You're not worth my time, nor my presence." And through their actions, those who initially rejected God's invitation, those who paid no attention and went away to their fields and to their businesses, they represent the religious leaders and systems of that day who couldn't be bothered to show up for the poor and the outcast. And that's what lies at the core of this parable. Because you see, from the immediate context, that is what Matthew chose to place right before this passage and right after this passage, we see a pattern emerge. This parable is part of a series of encounters in which Jesus challenges the religious authorities. And specifically in this parable, these are the ones who metaphorically stayed home. And that's the point here. The parable of the wedding party is meant to teach us about overcoming injustice. And I believe that Matthew is saying that injustice is finally overcome by God's inclusive, unconditional love, extending to all people, both the good and the bad, the text tells us. Both the good and the bad, all are welcomed, all are included. You see, there's no litmus test for inclusion here, nor seemingly any conditions on belonging. The ruler makes it clear that the good and the bad are equally welcome to participate. But then there's this other problem in this text. The only requirement for this banquet seems to be that you have to be dressed for the occasion, right? That's the stumbling block. Seems kind of weird, doesn't it?
Yes.
It doesn't seem to track with Jesus' wider vision or ministry. And it doesn't fit the tone or tenor of this story. Why is the ruler so offended that one guest doesn't have the proper wedding attire? I mean, maybe they didn't have the money to buy the proper clothes. And since they were whisked so quickly off the street, maybe they didn't have time to prepare themselves. Who knows? Maybe they didn't have a gift. Maybe they didn't think anyone would notice. There are any number of reasons, logical and valid reasons, why this person wasn't dressed properly. But that's finally not the point here. You see, in a parable, everything stands for something. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the significance of the wedding robe or lack thereof? Well, the person without the wedding garment symbolizes those who reject the call to align themselves with God's vision of justice for this world, thus excluding themselves from God's banquet. And this isn't because they're somehow bad, but because they refuse to adorn the clothing of God's grace and God's justice. And the same is true in our world. Too often, I think we choose to exclude ourselves from engaging with the challenges of our times. We choose to exclude ourselves when we let fear or apathy cause us to look away or mind our own business while the planet burns. Our parable for today ends with an ominous statement, doesn't it? Many are invited, but few are chosen. But perhaps in this context, perhaps in our context, we need to have an addendum to that. Many are invited, but few are chosen, because too few choose to respond to the invitation. Too few choose to respond to the invitation. We choose instead to exclude ourselves from the things that are of God. You know, a few years ago, I read something by Maya Angelou that's really stuck with me. She said that you can know if something is of God when it looks, acts, talks, walks like Jesus. All good religion, she said, is a daily practice of kindness and fairness, generosity and respect. It's a humility that knows the work is never finished. It's love embodied in action. Not belief shouted from pulpits or legislated into law. And it's always being willing to ask. Always being willing to ask, who's being left out? Maybe my friend was upset because through my absence, I wasn't only excluding myself, but in a very real way, I was distancing myself from her. And sometimes, when the world is burning, when injustice just seems too big, too scary, too hateful for us to handle, we exclude ourselves. But when we do that, are we not distancing ourselves from God? So where do we go from here? When our life or our shared lives together seem like it's so much, what do? Well, perhaps we can turn back to the words of Maya Angelou and ask, who's being left out? And then include that person or group of persons in our lives and in the life of our church. We can ask ourselves, who's hungry? And then use our resources to feed that person. We can ask ourselves, who's thirsty? And then use our experience of God and our understanding of the living water to quench their thirst. We can ask ourselves, who's being oppressed? And then we can use our privilege to bring freedom and liberation to that person. We can ask ourselves, who's being drowned out? And then we can use our voice to speak for justice and equality. And finally, we can ask ourselves, who's being excluded from God's banquet? And then invite them to the table and serve them. And that's the final thought today. Service. When we serve our neighbor, when we serve the least of God's beloved, when we serve all people, by inviting all people, by including all people, and by loving all of God's people, when we do that, when we put God's love into action, that's when we are finally including ourselves at God's banquet table. And it's through service to others, my friends, that we finally find ourselves. May it become so. Amen.
Amen.